So our next speaker, our next keynote is Dr. Vanessa Ball, who is GASAP's Karmazin Lillard Endowed Chair in Adult Autism and also an associate professor in the clinical and applied departments at GASAP. Dr. Ball is also the co-director of research here at the RCAS and the director of our psychological services clinic. And there is a much more lengthy bio for Vanessa in your program. And with that, I'll hand off to Vanessa, who will take it away.
Thank you to Lara for taking the laptop. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see my face. And so we're going to switch quickly so you don't have a giant picture of my face on your screen. So hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here and fortunate or unfortunate to go after Henry, who has been a phenomenal trainee here at GASAP and who we've continued to learn from. And frankly, as happy as I am for him going off to internship, I'm a little bit sad for myself. He's taught us a lot. And actually, I think some of the things we'll talk about today are conversations that Henry and others in our group have had. So I want to talk to you today about the critical role of mental health in supporting neurodiverse students, but also particularly within the Rutgers University and within post-secondary education. So you probably have seen headlines that talk about the college mental health crisis. How many of you, when you were in college or even in high school, experienced stress? How many of you have maybe at some point in your studies experienced anxiety? How many of you have maybe felt lonely or experienced depression? And to what extent did any of those things prevent you from being your best self? From showing up, from being in your classes, from being fully engaged, doing the things that you want to do, pursuing the passions that you want to pursue. So we are facing a crisis as a nation, frankly, probably across the world. This is just one study that looked at over 600,000 undergraduates over the course of like 8 years. This was before COVID, you guys. So we were seeing reports of up to over 60% of individuals feeling overwhelming anxiety. 40% endorsed having been so depressed that it was difficult to function. These are undergraduate students. And we know that mental health has adverse outcomes for post-secondary outcomes, right? So lower GPAs, discontinuous college enrollment, lower graduation rates. So this is a problem that we need to be thinking about at the university level. And sadly, I think our school system, even down to elementary, have taken this sort of turn where they're separating out emotional health and academics and really pushing academics. And now I think COVID has reminded us the importance of emotional well-being, of social and emotional health. And so we're seeing more and more of that coming back into the schools. You know, my son is going to start kindergarten next year. And I was mixed feelings when the principal said to me, guess what? We have revamped our kindergarten program. For the afternoon, they have playtime. And I was like, whoa, what do you mean? What were they doing before if not playing? If not learning how to navigate social relationships, if not learning how to cope with their own disappointments, right? And so this has had a huge impact all the way down to our college students. We know within individuals on the autism spectrum that they're at higher risk for depression, for anxiety, for suicide. And this is much higher than adults in the general population. And if you talk to autistic adults and autistic researchers, as Teal Benavides did in this paper, they list mental health as one of the top 3 priorities for future research focused on adults on the autism spectrum. So some of our team has really been interested in thinking about how do we support mental health in autistic students in post-secondary education. And I'll venture to say, I think a lot of these things will apply more broadly to neurodiverse students, not just those who have diagnoses of autism. But in this paper, we've talked about how post-secondary education can be particularly stressful for individuals on the autism spectrum, and that often we have really phenomenal support programs for academics, for navigating organization, for promoting academic outcomes. And many of those programs are starting to include social supports as well. But we're not fully attending to mental health. And the prolonged stress of having to navigate different situations in post-secondary ed can have really detrimental effects. So what might make college stressful? Probably none of these things are going to be surprising to you. These are things that make college stressful for everyone. But for some individuals, particularly those who are neurodiverse, these things may be really, really difficult to manage and additionally stressful. So variability is sort of what defines college life. Your day-to-day schedule might not look the same. I mean, sometimes you have Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday classes. If you're lucky, you have a Friday that's open, right? But you're constantly navigating different environments. You're going from the lecture hall. Sometimes you're in smaller classrooms. Sometimes you're on Zoom. You know, I shudder to even mention the bus, right? You also have different expectations across all of campus. There's a lot of emphasis on things being student-led. It's up to you as a student to figure out what you want to do, when you need to do it, and what happens if you don't do it. How do you navigate that? Okay, there's different assignment structures. If you look at syllabi across different professors, they all look pretty different. Sometimes they're a puzzle in and of themselves. Okay, and that's just the sort of day-to-day practicalities. We also have really complex social demands within our post-secondary systems. So across settings, you might be hanging out with people in a classroom, surrounded by students, and there's a professor. You might have to go grab lunch at the cafeteria. Then you might go home and want to relax. So maybe you share a room, you share a dorm room with someone else, right? And the social expectations, even though you might be surrounded by people the same exact age, even though sometimes you might actually be with the same people across some of those settings, how you are expected to behave or act can be really different. There are also just a ton of people on campus, right? And so how you navigate interactions with people like teaching assistants who are roughly the same age as you, but there is a hierarchy built in. Some of them take that hierarchy pretty seriously. There are professors, you have your classmates, you have your roommates. So all of these complex social demands interwoven with the complex environment. And how do you know when you're supposed to, kind of be casual and hang out with your roommate, but then suddenly you're in office hours with that same roommate and a professor, and there are different rules that apply. There are many factors that exacerbate an already pretty stressful experience. So there is an extremely high demand for self-advocacy, even within students who have good supports. They have Office of Disability supports, they have college support program supports. This requires them to disclose their diagnosis. So they already have to have some self-advocacy, or maybe parents that are supporting them, but they have to make that decision that they're coming to the university and they're going to share that diagnosis for the benefit of them getting supports that hopefully access to what they need. Some students don't want to do that. Some students see college as a place to come and be who they are. We're all sort of exploring our identities and figuring out who we are at that key transitional period in our life, right? You get to be an adult. You get to, stay up all night and play video games. You can eat ice cream for breakfast in the dorm. Like, the world is your oyster, right? So some students don't want to disclose the diagnosis, and that's another conversation of why is there stigma around that for them? But that should be their choice. Again, if they don't, how do they get access to these services? We could talk about the sensory experience for a lot of neurodiverse students, being in lecture halls that are noisy, that are, or even when a professor is talking, there's always little sounds If we stop for a moment, you'll hear somebody's clicking on their laptop, somebody's clicking their pen, somebody's shuffling their feet. Some of these noises are really amplified for people, particularly those on the spectrum, but for a whole host of neurodiverse individuals. The lights aren't good for any of us, frankly, but the bright lights, the poor temperature control is, and this is not a knock on facilities. They do their best, but you put a bunch of people in a building on a humid day, right? The seats might be uncomfortable. All of these things compound to create and add stress. And then stigma. Other people's knowledge, their expectations, and Henry even talked about, right? Feeling the need to mask or camouflage. So the idea that they need to hide their differences, that they need to put on a show in order to fit some social expectation. And there are many, many studies that talk about how this relates to or leads to autistic burnout, which is just exhaustion. And also newer research that shows that stress and anxiety is associated not just with having to always mask, but also with switching. So you might think like, oh, but I have this one place that they can be on campus, they can be themselves. That's great. But then they have to go somewhere else and they have to switch. And that is just as stressful and anxiety provoking. So this idea that we can create a safe space, a haven, we need to think bigger. And then finally, the big sort of soapbox that I am constantly emphasizing, we do not have enough mental health providers to support this need. And frankly, we don't have enough mental health support providers to support nationwide, but particularly for individuals on the autism spectrum. You ask clinicians, this is just in community mental health, but I bet if we asked those on campus, they identify a number of barriers to providing and supporting autistic individuals. And so we need to think about, why is it that autism is viewed as only being able to be supported by a very specific and select group of people? Why is it that Office of Disability Services or a college support program or a psychological services clinic for adults on the spectrum is the only place that is seen as the place that they can get support? So I want to talk about a vision that I've had, a tiny vision on a small scale, but to think about a tiered approach to supporting neurodiverse Rutgers students, particularly in the realm of mental health. And so you'll forgive me, this is sort of a medical model approach to thinking about prevention, to thinking about supporting mental health. So in healthcare, you think about primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions. So primary is things that you do before the bad things happen, right? Things to promote well-being, to prevent mental health problems. Secondary are things that you do sort of actively, you're screening, you're trying to identify problems at an early stage. So hopefully it doesn't take as many resources to address them. And then tertiary, of course, we can't prevent depression and anxiety in everyone. There is a biological component to these conditions. And so, there are also needs for specific therapies and supports when people need them. And so I'm going to give you some examples of things that we have been doing here on Rutgers campus already. And I'm going to caution in saying that these are small things, and these are not novel or necessarily innovative. These are things that many of you are probably already doing, and hopefully after today, you will think more about expanding. So if we think about primary, and primary is at the bottom, because it's the foundation, you do a lot in primary prevention to try to support people so that there are fewer people who need high levels of support. So, the first thing, if you think about a primary preventative approach and promoting well-being, preventing mental health problems, is to make a place where everybody feels welcome. Okay. And so we have these kinds of events, right? Like, we are on the right path. We can think about integrating neurodiversity training for onboarding of staff, faculty, of TAs, department heads. We can think about embedding neurodiversity and information about autism and ADHD and other features of neurodiversity in the curricula. So as Dr. Menente highlighted, things like burn seminars for first-year students. We also have a number of classes. Consultation service. When you have students who need a higher level of care or who need supports, they don't always have to only go to someone who knows something about autism or something about ADHD or something about learning disorders. They need maybe someone to consult with the professional or the professor or the TA that they have. So setting up some sort of supports or ways that those people who know their jobs and just need a little bit of support to help one specific student or a group of students. The other thing that I've become fond of over the years is making so-called accommodations available to everyone without requiring someone to say, hi, I need this thing. How can we make this so that this is an environment where everyone can or has access to some of the things that they need? So one of the things I do in my classes is I give a quiz. They get points. First week, everyone fills out a getting to know you survey. And this actually stems from my own anxiety as an undergrad. I was not a kid who was ever going to raise their hand. If I had to get 10 participation points, I would very carefully and meticulously plan out what questions would I have to answer to get those points. And other than that, I would sit quietly. I was a good student. I loved academia and here, but I was not going to raise my hand. I didn't have to. And so I am really respectful of the experience of individuals that might have that same level of anxiety. Because guess what? I missed out on a lot of learning because those weeks I knew I had to raise my hand. I was rehearsing what I was going to say in my mind. And I was not listening as well to the people around me. I mean, come on, right? So the getting to know you survey is tell me things about yourself. It might be your pronouns. It might be that you don't like to raise your hand in class. It might be that you prefer to sit in a certain area. It might be that you feel a need to color or doodle during class to help you stay focused. Any of those things are fine. It's also an opportunity to tell me if you have ODS supports. So you don't have to initiate a special email to me. You can say it there. You can say, I don't have ODS supports, but I wish I had this other thing, right? So that we can get to work with you. Another example, I've been sort of consulting with some different organizations recently, is the idea of noise canceling headsets for everyone. So some people like to have them, but there's actually more people out there than you would guess who are sensitive to sound and or who can't work in a busy environment, right? We're all into these group sort of like open desk settings, and that's not great for a lot of people. So just having them available. If you want them, you can have them. You don't need a medical note to wear some headphones. And then also just making different break and workspaces available that have alternative lighting choices. You know, we're seeing more and more of this, even, and I don't know if this is intentional from a neurodiverse perspective, things like quiet train cars, right? Things like break areas, sensory, I don't know what they call them always, but different places, not the autistic safe haven, just the place, a quiet break space that someone could go in, and if you shut the door, no one bothers you. Okay, but this is available to anybody. So if I'm having a bad day, I might go hide in the break room and close the door and hope that nobody's going to find me, right? So another example. So this is with a colleague of mine, Evan Kleiman. We've developed what's called the emotional support plan. For those of you who might be in psychology, this is modeled after a suicide safety plan with the idea that when you are in highly stressful situation, it's really hard to remember all the resources that you have. And so what we wanted is for things to be right at your fingertips. This is not for suicidal autistic students. This is something that we imagined as when autistic students might be feeling overwhelmed, is the most common word, that they would have a plan on how to cope in that particular situation. And we thought that having it on your phone would be nice because everybody usually has their phone. We've actually heard that just the act of going through and creating this plan has been really helpful for people. And so this is, you know, thinking about the warning signs These are triggers, things that you expect might be stressful for you. It might be talking to a professor, it might be going and being in a really loud classroom, whatever that might be. And then we help them come up with just a couple of strategies of what they can do to manage their emotions in that moment, in that setting. So sometimes we distract ourselves by playing video games or doing something. Well, if you're supposed to be talking to your professor, that's not going to work, right? So trying to help teach and develop really brief sort of mindfulness exercises, deep breathing, whatever it might be. And then we also help them identify positive supports in their personal lives, reasons that they might sort of remind themselves why it's important to manage their feelings in that moment, why it would not be a good idea to yell at the professor or to run out of the room, ways that they can help to make the environment itself feel less stressful, and then professional resources in case they do need some more intensive supports. Not a good time to be Googling what is the warm line or the suicide hotline or the CAPS emergency number, right? We want all of that to be at their fingertips. Then another thing that is brand new, is not officially been released, so today is sort of like the soft release, I guess, is our new mental health guide for autistic college students. So this is a partnership. These are two students who've really led this work, and this is going to be put out by the Organization for Autism Research very soon. I think it's about a 12-page guide, and you can kind of read the highlights here. But it's supposed to be for students who are maybe entering into post-secondary ed. And the highlights of what we think is important for them to be thinking about and to knowing as they're getting ready for that transition, and also for parents. And particularly trying to focus on what kinds of supports might be available. How do you navigate the systems in order to get those supports? So we have a little script, for example, if you're going to call the counseling and psychological services clinic, it gives you a little bit of script of what you might say. And so, we will disseminate this more widely as they're still working out the website. But I think the QR code will work. So it's, like I said, 12 or 13 pages. And then we also have one that's just plain, sort of without all the pictures in case that's too distracting. If we move on to secondary care, we're thinking about monitoring and then referral as needed. And so I'm looking at Courtney because she was phenomenal in helping us try to do this. So this is really pretty much the only data I think I'll show you today. If you can see it, it's sort of at the bottom. So these are real students in the college support program. We tried to see everybody prior to their coming to campus. So sometime between June and sometimes we caught people right when they got to campus. We did an initial assessment that included some information about mental health. And then we could flag for the CSP team if there was somebody we might be a little bit worried about, just elevated, and either in terms of their qualitative responses or on the questionnaires falling in a clinical range for depressive or anxiety symptoms. And then in the first few weeks, first half of the semester or so, we sent them via RedCap brief surveys, about 16 questions, I think, to assess anxiety and depressive symptoms. And those are the little sort of dots that you see there. You notice there's a lot of missing dots. So we didn't chase after people too much, but we did check in with Courtney if somebody stopped filling them out for a long period of time. Hey, are you still talking to this person? It's okay if they're not filling out our survey, but we want to make sure no one is, so we want to make sure that no one's falling off the radar, right? That they're staying engaged. And then we went to bi-weekly toward the end of the semester. So, those first few semesters, we were really trying to monitor people. And then the last half of the semester, trying to be a little more respectful and people are busy. And then if there was risk, so there's a question about thoughts of suicide, then we would flag. Sometimes we would contact them directly. Sometimes we'd work with CSP and their coordinators to talk about them. And then if somebody had an elevated symptom level or was on a trajectory that suggested things were building, then we might try to check in with Courtney as well. We had a pretty high threshold for bothering people. I'm going to be, we were really careful. Like, we kind of expect most people to feel a little bit of stress as they're transitioning in, right? If you told us that you were thinking about ending your life or hurting yourself, we were all over you. I'm sorry. Because your safety is our priority. And so we would text, we would, stand outside the office where Courtney was going to see them. Everybody was on board. But, if and most students stayed in kind of the mild range of symptoms, and we weren't going to bother them every week. But we did sort of watch for people to fall outside of that threshold. And then we actually pulled them into the ESP study if we could as well to try to get them support. These are mostly students who are like, leave me alone, things are fine. And then if we think about tertiary care, that final step, so students who are still struggling, who need those additional supports, some of them who have come in with depression or anxiety, clinical diagnoses prior to college, right? The college may exacerbate that. We're thinking about ways to adapt evidence-based mental health treatments specifically to support autistic individuals. So we have Beat It, which is a program that comes out of the UK and our collaborators there. It was actually designed for adults with intellectual disability. So it's a very simple kind of, not a lot of emphasis on talking, I guess. And that's a behavioral activation treatment for depression. And so we've had some funding to work on that. Just to be clear, this isn't college students specifically, but we've been fortunate to have these studies open so we can pull some students in when they need those supports, and then it's free care. We're also working with Brian Chu, who's another faculty member who focuses on youth, so adolescents with depression, anxiety, anger issues, and we're adapting and scaling that program up. This is a group-based program that is much more, it's behavioral activation to support anger or anxiety or depression, but it's a little more cognitive, a little more at the level of college students who really like to sort of think through all the details of the problem. And then we're trying through different articles, such as the one on the top left there, to really think about how do we help clinicians to think about supporting neurodiverse individuals, particularly adults on the autism spectrum, and doing what they already know how to do. How do we think about supporting them to go the next step and not use autism as an exclusion from their clinics? And so giving some guidelines and thinking about how do we engage individuals in therapy or therapists already, and to open up their practices to support people. Because the reality is a lot of individuals that we see don't need specialty care. They need someone who's open and a little bit flexible, that some sessions might take 2 weeks instead of 1. Sometimes a visual support might be beneficial. Sometimes it's not worth arguing about one specific detail and moving on. Those are not rocket science. And as much as I believe in my own expertise, there's a lot of clinicians out there that could do this with maybe a phone call to me, and probably, quite frankly, without me. But we need to break down those barriers and make sure that they understand that they have those skills already. So if we think about, my big push is to think about how do we integrate neurodiversity training in general psychology training. There can still be specialists. There are still individuals on the autism spectrum who absolutely need specialty care. But we also need to prepare our workforce of psychologists and social workers and other mental health providers to be open to and feel competent to, or at least, sort of culturally humble and open to supporting autistic individuals. We need to think about how we can utilize the existing graduate programs, the existing on-campus services to provide these opportunities. So all the autistic students don't need to come to my clinic, that we send them to CAPS, and we want them to be supported in the systems that make the most sense for them. And we need to look closer at how we are accessing these different systems. So streamlining access. We have had students where we literally are on the phone with CAPS and the providers. And this is not a dig at CAPS at all, but where there have been real barriers because for that student, it's been too hard to vocalize exactly what they need. And the person on the other end doesn't know exactly how to support that. Okay, so we need to think about supports just to navigate the systems. And also, maybe most importantly, just decoupling those supports from specialty care services. They can come here. Everyone is welcome here at our clinic for adults on the spectrum. But what if you don't want to come to the Adult Autism Center? I mean, who wouldn't want to come? It's beautiful, yes, but why do you have to say, I have a diagnosis of autism, but I want treatment for anxiety, right? Why do we make that happen? So, moving forward, I think that we just need to think about how we can take a multi-tiered approach to mental health within our larger systems. And I know this is a system of higher education, and this is only one facet that will help students be successful. But I'm a psychologist, and so I am biased that this is a really important piece. And so thinking about primary, secondary, tertiary, kind of from a model perspective, and really emphasizing a lot of the primary supports. But I want to be clear, at each of these levels, it's a lot of resources. There was a lot more that I would have liked to do with students as we were monitoring. Frankly, they didn't really want to talk to us. So, we saw a lot of variability. It took a lot of effort to chase students down sometimes if we did have concerns. Courtney can attest. We had a lot of back and forth and multiple students sometimes. And so I think we need to think about also the students on the other side of it. That's potentially added stress. It's added work for them. So how do we accomplish some of that secondary care without further burdening already stressed out students? And just, all of this, all of mental health care, I think some of the challenges are that it is time and person intensive, and people cost money, and that's really challenging. And so that's where we're trying to think about these brief models like the emotional support plan. Henry was involved in helping us to develop a self-guided version. We're still collecting data and working on that. And we'll see where that goes. But I think there are also existing frameworks for thinking about mental health on campus and across campuses, things like JED Campus, that we can also maybe benefit from partnering with and building on the infrastructure. So I'll end and just acknowledge there's been so many people who have supported this. And I think this is something, it's so wonderful to be here and have the chance to talk with you about, because I think this is something that's near and dear to my heart. And I think it will really has the potential to impact just what Henry was saying, helping individuals to succeed in doing what they want to do and what they're here to do, making sure that mental health and stress is not a barrier to that. Thank you.